Hey, everybody. Welcome to Distorted Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Ashley Kelly, business owner and a mom and a friend of mine, friend of the shows. We're going to talk today about boundaries. And it's a well-versed topic. There's lots of books written about it. We're going to try to make sense out of it. We're going to talk about why we have boundaries, ways to keep them solid so they're not violated, maybe some of the fear around why we either do or don't have boundaries. And we're going to try to give you a simple way to think of them using a format, request change in behavior format. So that being said, let me welcome Ashley. Hello, Ashley.
Thanks for having me, Lenny.
You're welcome. I'll get us started. Let's talk a little bit about, let's first off talk about boundaries, just the concept of them, and as it applies to relationships, obviously. Why are boundaries important? Let's start with that.
Well, I think that is a really hard question to answer because there's so many reasons, right? But I think at the base of it is because we all deserve to be treated like we are created in God's image, and we deserve to have people treat us with respect, with love, with kindness, with the fruit of the Spirit. And when people are going outside of that, and everyone will, because we're all sinful. So I think that there's grace there, right? And sometimes when we have that mentality that, we have to be walking in grace, we can take even that to an extreme where we don't set boundaries. So I think boundaries are really important because it protects us in who we are and who we are made to be. And it also protects those that are around us and those that we're setting the boundaries with, because it's showing them that certain behaviors are not okay and that we won't allow those behaviors. And that if those behaviors are implemented, then there will be consequences to that. And that is just how it is in life ever since we are young. And we set boundaries with our kids. We set boundaries with everyone around us, whether we're aware of them or not. So I think it's just a way of being able to have relationships, healthy relationships, and boundaries are required to have healthy relationships, in my opinion.
You said a bunch of good stuff, the consequence piece, why we verbalize the boundary so it's known, why it's not a violation of grace and these types of concepts, that we interact with people in a loving way, but knowing that we are, prone to make mistakes and prone to be human and selfish and all these other good things too, that sometimes we forget the other person has a right to the space that we also occupy. And the consequence piece, we'll talk about that when we talk about requesting changes in behavior. I think that's something that gets overlooked when it comes to adult conversation, but it's easy for us to remember them when it comes to children, which you mentioned. Boundaries with children, I think, are different in that ultimately, because the child is dependent on us to keep them safe, the boundaries are probably more frequent, and there's probably a quicker pathway to consequence when it comes to our children, because they have to be guarded from their inability to make those decisions independent, right? So, obviously, thus the word dependent, right? So I think it's really good for us to be able to say, when we approach it from an adult perspective, that although the consequence exists, it's not always a mandate in order to get the change. Also, I like the idea of addressing this, the boundary that's communicated is to facilitate the relationship to grow. It is a way to respect one another. Take it outside of marriage, even with friendships, right? Or coworkers. Boundaries are very important, like you said, to keep people reminded of, we share space, and we can do that lovingly or we can do that cruelly, right? So, the person who inactivates the boundary has an expectation, but they're also responsible for holding up whatever it is that they're putting out there as a boundary. Let me add another piece too, because when we talk about requesting the change in behavior, one of the other pieces to this is that the request for change can be denied. And so the boundary becomes doubly important, because if your request for change is denied, you better have a strong enough boundary to stay resilient if in fact you're denied your change. Does that sound about right?
Yes, it does. And I've noticed that it's really hard for especially the clients that I saw when I would do counseling. I saw a pattern where it was really, really hard for people to request boundaries and to verbalize that, especially with other adults, like you said. And or if it was a parent-child relationship, but the child is now an adult, or vice versa, if the child's requesting a change from the parent and they're an adult now. And it goes on. It's not just within that dynamic, but with any relationship, even at work, to verbalize a boundary can feel really scary and intimidating. So I really liked those 5 steps that you had, because it really lays it out and it shows you how to do this in a simple way where it doesn't feel like you're coming against someone or attacking someone. So can you just quickly share how, like, should we role play it, or what do you think is the best way to show how we can do that?
I can give it to you in a quick conversation. I can just, it starts off with, first of all, I'll just do it and then I'll explain what I did.
Okay.
I know this is important for you to talk to me today. So while we're talking, would you mind not yelling at me? If you yell at me, I'm probably not going to be able to stay in the conversation. I'm going to leave. That's it. And it's so fast that you don't realize you're actually setting up something. So let me break that down for everybody. The validation happens first, which is a simple statement to put credit or to put quality to you and the other person that you're talking to. It's, again, the easiest form of it is to lower defense so the person knows this is not an attack. This is a request. And it's ironic, and I know ADD is a terrible thing to waste, so I'm going to say it. It's ironic that validation is a pivotal piece to the intimacy chain that we'll probably talk about in the next podcast. But the intimacy chain of validation is huge from male to female. So you're going to see that come up again. Back to this. So the validation is the premise to allow yourself to now speak the rest of the request. So first piece, state what is happening. State it with a request of why it's upsetting or why you'd like it to change, and then put out the change. So there's 3 pieces there, 2, 3, and 4, which is to state what the problem is, reference how it's affecting you, and then putting out the change, putting out the option, the negotiation, if you will. The consequence I added, even though I don't have to add it, which is that I might have to end or walk away from the conversation. So interesting to how it flows. I want to say one side note, and then we can go back again. When we talk about the implication that what the other person is doing is having an effect on me, I want to make sure we're very clear on that. With the cognitive approach that I like to use, and I think you like it too, we're not placing blame on the other person for how we felt. We are acknowledging the behavior that they did. We're saying that we felt a certain way about it, but we're not saying that it's the fault of the other person that we feel that way. We're just claiming our emotion in that. We're just claiming it. I could be upset or hurt or sad. I could have lots of different options. If you were mean to me, I have lots of different selections as to what emotion I pick. Okay, so that being said,
when you yell at me, I feel scared, or when you're yelling at me, I feel agitated. You're kind of expressing that, yes, when you do this, I have this feeling, but you're taking ownership of that response to the action. So you're not saying, you're making me feel angry.
Right.
Stop doing that. You're saying, when you do this, I feel angry. Correct. So it's the way of using your own emotions to express that I am taking ownership of how I feel, but your actions aren't okay in this moment.
Right. And then I'm going to offer up an alternative. And I can stop right there. So I can say, I know this conversation is important to both of us. Mm-hmm. But when you yell at me, I feel scared. What I would rather do is talk calmly. And I can stop right there. I don't have to offer consequence yet. And typically when it's another adult, I may not offer consequence until it's violated a second time. Right.
Right.
So if you're looking at it very critically, you could say, well, that would be the grace component. I'm going to offer that person some space to correct themselves, because I'm going to count on the idea that maybe, probably they do, not maybe, but probably they're going to want to modify because they care about the relationship too, whether it's friend or partner. And so I'm giving them an opportunity to change without saying, oh, if you don't do it right away, I'm going to punish you, or I'm not going to love you anymore, or whatever we would say. So we're not throwing out the consequence right away. We're just stating that for the first 4 lines. And again, I said before, I want to double down on this too. The other person, because I'm giving them permission, they don't have to change. They might have reasons why they're acting the way they're acting. That doesn't preclude you from having a consequence if it has to be there, which is, again, what you said at the very beginning. A boundary is something that you might be putting out to protect yourself. So there's a limit to what you would allow happen. And the consequence is a way to reinforce it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think it's really important to realize how to express this, because a lot of times we just want to jump right to stop yelling, or in this example that you gave, we want to just get to it quickly, or we want to say, you make me feel frustrated, but we don't want to go through the steps, which is the only way to really help the other person truly understand what's going on, and so that they're not going to be on the defense. And I think that's so important, because yes, boundaries are good and they are important, but there is a right and a wrong way to also express it. I've experienced, even in my own relationships, people in my life, they will get frustrated with someone in the family or whatever it could be, and they are setting an appropriate boundary, but how they're approaching that is wrong in itself, right? They are getting either defensive or frustrated, and they're reacting in that emotion versus taking a step back and expressing it in a way that is a healthy way to express, hey, I need this space, I need this boundary. And I think that this is a really simple thing to implement, but it doesn't feel natural, and it doesn't feel like the normal way to have a conversation. So it really takes practice and repetition, and even just like reading it out and memorizing how to verbalize that.
Yeah, you have to practice. Absolutely. You have to practice, number one. You have to get better at it. Just like if you're trying to be assertive, you're trying to go from being, shy and embarrassed to being more assertive. That's not something you do overnight. The tone matters. The volume matters. The emotional trigger that a lot of people have comes from the misunderstanding of what's being said, because they're not hearing what's being said. They're hearing how it's being said. So that's exactly what happens. So if I'm hearing how it's being said, I immediately, focus on that, and I respond in kind. I elevate. I raise my voice. I'm going to yell back. I'm not listening to the content of the message, which is really what it's all about. So in the other thing too is, remember, the other person has their own perspective. And you see this macro level in society, micro level in relationship. I'm not listening to you. I'm just loaded up and ready to throw back what I already thought. And so if I'm throwing at you what I think and you're throwing at me what you think, neither one of us is listening. That's just for true. If we're calm enough to listen, we can actually disagree and listen. Disagreement can come with a consequence. And let me touch on this really quick. Consequence, we need to kind of break that word down. Consequence is not a negative word, folks. It's a word. It's a consequence is something that's going to happen after a. And consequence could be positive. If I exercise, the consequence is I might be healthier. So that's a consequence that's not negative. It's just something that happens after. Oftentimes when we think of consequence, we're always thinking it's bad. When it comes to consequence with children, it's usually something to keep them safe that they're unaware of. I would assume for everyone out there that would be a good thing, that if your child is safe because you put up a boundary, for instance, when they go out trick-or-treating, they cannot eat the whole bag of candy when they get home. That would be a boundary, and there'd be a consequence. Not only would you probably have to restrict that, but they'd probably get a stomach ache. And so there'd be 2 consequences, right? Again, I want to be clear on this. that it does take practice like anything else. When you're looking to change behavior, you have to implement change in perception, and then you have to practice. Let's segue into sort of the consequences of the violation of the boundary, because we already talked about the consequence in this terminology. The most common way a boundary fails, the person who puts the boundary out carries the initial momentum of how effective that boundary is going to be. It's not the person who's receiving the information. So if I put out a boundary, it's up to me, like we can use a client example. There's a boundary around it because there's a time schedule to it. The determination of when that session should start comes from me because I set it, or I give the availability, right? And then
so you as a therapist have a boundary with a client that your session will be an hour, let's just say.
Yeah, right.
And so in that example, you both are aware we're meeting for an hour. So then keep going. What happens if...
Yeah, so then now I'm the one that's in charge of the premise. It's not up to the client to adhere to the hour. It's not their responsibility. It's not their boundary. It's my responsibility.
To pay attention to the clock, to give them a warning when, hey, we're almost at 5 minutes. Is there anything else that you want to cover today, or we can carry this on for next week? So you're, as the one setting that boundary, having to keep track of that, to put the parameters around it, and to be aware of that. Right, because now we talk about the idea of the violation of the boundary. Most of the time it's violated. Again, before we get to the resistance, we'll talk about that next. But the idea of the boundary is that my lack of enforcement gives the other person permission to not respect it. So if it's an hour and a half later and I have done nothing or said nothing, then it's not the person's fault that the violation took place. The only time I can shift that is if I make both of us aware, because again, it's my initial boundary. Oh, by the way, remember I said I don't want to eat Brussels sprouts this week. And the other person brings Brussels sprouts home and cooks them and puts them on the plate in front of me. And I'm like, what the heck? I thought we weren't having Brussels sprouts. That type of violation can only take place if two things are in place. One, I have spoken about what the boundary is. I mean, this is what you said right up front. If I don't verbalize the boundary, there isn't one. So there's no violation. If I verbalize it and the other person says, yeah, I don't agree with that, then the conversation takes place, right? Then we get, so talk about maybe the second half of this when we say, if you're on the same page with me, about how I initiate the boundary and I can be the first one to actually violate it. Let's talk about the resistance from the other side. Can you speak about what does that violation look like per se, and what would we do with it? Well, I guess in the example you gave, if I'm understanding what you're asking here, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but if, for example, the client is resisting that boundary, they may be at the very end of a session after you've already said, okay, we have 5 minutes left today. They may drop something really big on you at the very end of a session and expect you as the counselor to unpack that with them, even though they know that there's only 5 minutes left. So they might be resisting that boundary by trying to push the envelope there and to test and see, okay, well, maybe, and it could be a subconscious thing or it could be a conscious thing where they are trying to see, okay, is he going to go past this time? He said I only have 5 minutes, but I really want to talk about this. Is he going to be there for me in this moment and lengthen the session for me? And so that could just be one way that someone is showing that they're resisting that boundary. And then it would be up to you to then reiterate, wow, that is a really interesting topic to bring up right now at the end of the session. And that is where we'll start next time. And so there are always going to be ways, I think, as the boundary setter to really reinforce that I am going to stick to this no matter what it is. And that's not easy to do because there is going to be resistance sometimes from the person you're setting the boundary with. And it can feel unloving, like in that example that I just gave.
Right.
It would almost be like, well, if you're a good counselor and this person is all of a sudden saying that they have this really big issue that they didn't talk about in the first 50 minutes, then you should sit there with them and talk if you don't have another client coming in. But you're missing the bigger picture, which is there is an element of showcasing as a counselor what healthy boundaries are, and even just staying within the time is a way of building trust, building a healthy relationship, and showing the client what a healthy relationship is. And so I think that we can also translate that into our other relationships in our life and realize that sometimes when someone seems to be resisting a boundary, whether it's, say, you have a parent and a grandparent who wants to take the kids to a special event. This actually is something that one of my friends had mentioned in the past. And she told the parent, no, the kids can't go that day. We're busy. And the grandparent then proceeded, instead of saying, okay, I understand, the grandparent went to the child in front of the parent and said, hey, would you like to go to this park today? And now they're using the child to kind of manipulate the parent into saying yes, since it's in front of the child. And so that grandparent resisted that boundary that the parent set. And now the child's getting involved, right? And so instead, that parent said, well, I'm sorry, we already discussed this. We're not going to be able to go to that park today. And in those instances, it can feel really hard because it can seem like, well, I know the grandparent loves the grandchild. We could have changed our plans. I could have made an exception. But there's a lot at play there, that there was the disrespect. There were a lot of things to unpack, even within that example, with that grandparent resisting a boundary that the parent is setting in that relationship and in that dynamic.
So let me pause you there. I think that that's the thing that we're talking about with the resistance, is that it is very natural for you to second guess, especially when there's something on the line, right? The level of the relationship affects the strength of the boundary. And it's very easy to be, to move off of a boundary that you've set when it comes to loved ones, when it comes to family, because there's more, like you said, there's a lot more variables involved in something like that. I do think that it impacts us more in our personal lives, obviously, than professional, because professional, we hold on to those edicts that we have. The idea of feeling a little bit of remorse or guilt when you initiate a restriction with somebody, and usually for healthy reasons, it still comes with a potential for guilt. And I think my challenge to that, because you gave a great example of that, my challenge to that is, if you've done nothing wrong, then the idea of feeling guilt, in my words, would be a distortion. Something is distorted in the way you're approaching it to cause you to feel guilt, even though you haven't done anything wrong. But this does speak to the last element of what we want to cover, which is the fear people have, or the what's the right word? They're cautious about implementing boundaries because it doesn't seem like a loving thing to do, because it can very easily feel bad when the other person responds negatively or responds with sadness because we've put a limit to something, and so it's very easy then to second guess, which is what you pointed out, to second guess, wait a minute, I did feel like this was important, and now I'm second guessing it because the other person is having a less than positive response to me, and I'm affected by that. So you can feel bad about telling somebody no.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it is hard sometimes because I know, at least even in my own life, I just say, for example, with my kids, which is different, right? Like you said, it's very different when you're setting boundaries with your kids, but I feel like I say no all the time. So when I can say yes, I really like to say yes. And then you translate that into other relationships, and it's not fun to say no. It's not fun necessarily to set up a boundary or to have that conversation. And at the same time, it can be the most loving thing that you do. Because how I like to think about it is, if someone is treating me a way that is not okay, or they are crossing a boundary that I have in my life, then I let them continue to do that. How do you think they are going to act around other people? They're probably going to be doing the same thing that they do with me to others. So when I interact with that person, the most loving thing that I can actually do for them is to help them understand that that's not appropriate, or that's not okay, because now they have a safe place with me as someone who cares about them to navigate that and to work through that, and hopefully realize that it's not okay to talk to someone that way, or it's not okay to have those expectations. And then when they interact with others, maybe they'll be able to understand how to hold those boundaries, even with other people that haven't expressed that. So I feel
far better for the consequence to come from someone who cares about them than when it hits them from an outside resource that maybe not necessarily cares about what happens. Yes. And the consequence still exists. Yeah.
Yeah. I always think about, this is a silly example, I always think about those individuals that go on American Idol and they audition and they sound awful. I mean, awful. And I would too, because I cannot sing, right? But I'm very self-aware about that.
Yeah.
Now, some people aren't self-aware about that, apparently.
Right.
And I always wonder, why wouldn't anyone have told them that they are bad at singing? Like, why wouldn't anyone who cares about them or loves them, or even just like not let them go on this audition or this show? And it just always makes me think that sometimes there are people in our lives that we do need to speak up to. They may still go on the audition and have to face those consequences of being American and whatnot. But at least you tried, right? At least you communicated, you were trying to set a boundary. And if they decide not to follow that boundary, then they will have consequences with you, or they'll face natural consequences if they decide to go and do that out into the world. So I do think that it can feel unloving or unkind to say no to someone, or it can feel hard to do because you do love those people and you want to say yes, you want to invite them into your life more. And sometimes it's actually very loving to say no because they need that and you need that, and that's okay.
And that just a recap on that, it speaks to the two levels of the violation. The first violation being done by the self, the one who starts the boundary. The second violation coming from the person who the boundary was set for. And so either way, you can have a violation. And they are different. I tried to make those two things different. You know, the violation of self, when you are the one initiating a boundary, but you're not willing to enforce it with a consequence. And then the secondary violation that comes from the person who the boundary was placed on, who either doesn't agree or does agree, but doesn't do it to the expectation that's being set out. And then you added a nice piece to say the way that it's expressed matters. So hopefully with the request and change in behavior, to validate, to state the problem, to state how it's affecting you, to state the change, and then optionally state the consequence. That's your 5 steps. That's a way for us to approach boundary making in a healthy way, so that not only can we set the boundaries, but we can respect them, we can enforce them appropriately through grace. And another person on the other side has the same ability to listen and adhere to that, so that, again, relationships grow, safety's maintained, And I will say one more thing on this, and then I'll leave you to the last thought. Don't weaponize this. This is not to say that all day long you are wandering around telling people what you want them to do for you so you can be okay. That's not what this is for. So don't weaponize this, please. And last thoughts to you about this, Ashley. What would you like to leave the listener with?
I would just like to say that I believe that boundaries are good for everyone. They're good for the person giving them, and they're good for the person receiving them. And you're also, when you set boundaries, you're modeling that for the people you're setting boundaries with. And hopefully they're setting boundaries with you or with other people in their life. So I think that they're positive, and we can have this very negative connotation about boundaries. And so I just think it's that switching, even the way you think about boundaries can be distorted. And so turning that around and seeing them as positive is going to really be a life-changing component here.
Yeah, my wife would tell you no is a complete sentence. Thanks everybody for joining us. Appreciate you following, subscribing, however you like to do that. And we always will post new shows on Mondays, so look forward to the new shows, and we appreciate all your support. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.